Imagine having to buy back what you already own. That's what happened to the prophet Hosea. Then God ordered me, start all over. Love your wife again. Your wife who's in bed with her latest boyfriend. Your cheating wife. I did it. I paid good money to get her back. It cost me the price of a slave. Then I told her, from now on, you're living with me. No more whoring, no more sleeping around. You're living with me, and I'm living with you. God told Hosea to go and buy back what already belonged to him. Now, of course, in our modern world, the idea that a man would own a woman is offensive. It was a very real mentality in Old Testament times. Many women were slaves and thus owned by their masters, but even the master's wife would have technically been thought of as property, since the head of the household bore full responsibility for everything and everyone who lived in the house. So when you were married, you literally belonged to your husband. A man could divorce a woman, but a woman could not divorce a man. But even if they couldn't get a divorce, some women weren't concerned about remaining faithful to their husbands. And Gomer was one of those women. After she married Hosea, the Bible says she bore him a son. And then she bore 2 more children, but the Bible is very vague on the details of those kids. It doesn't say she bore them to Hosea, which implies that Gomer had already been unfaithful. And by the time we catch up with the story in chapter 3, she had left Hosea and had taken up residence with another man. The details of the situation aren't spelled out in the Bible, so we don't really know how Gomer ended up there. But it's clear that money and female companionship were involved. So when Hosea goes to retrieve her, he has to pay for her. And we don't know if the money he paid was some sort of bribe, maybe in order to get Gomer's boyfriend to kick her out, or if, as Gomer's husband, Hosea had to square up with the boyfriend for his wife's living expenses. Either way, it's kind of ridiculous that Hosea has to go and retrieve his own wife from another man's house. But that was exactly the prophetic point God was trying to make. He had been a faithful and steadfast husband to his people, Israel. And almost from the start of their relationship, they had been nothing but unfaithful to him. Imagine how God must have felt when his people continually rejected him. At the very beginning, he had saved them from starvation through Joseph, when famine had overtaken Egypt and all the surrounding lands. And later, he prospered them and blessed them, even in the midst of their slavery in Egypt. Then he rescued them from that slavery and cared for them miraculously in the wilderness. And he brought them into the promised land, the land flowing with milk and honey. Everything he did was designed to heap blessing after blessing after blessing upon them. But it's as if none of that mattered. No matter what God did, his people continued to run away from home and sell themselves to other gods, just as Gomer continued to run away from home to be with other men. How would you feel if your spouse pretended like they loved you, but kept having affairs with other people behind your back? Or even right in front of your face? What would you do? When I was in high school and we discussed dating and marriage in our senior Bible class, most everyone in my class said that adultery would be the line in the sand. Right? Adultery would be the one thing that would cause them to get a divorce. But in Hosea, we see a God who does not divorce the unfaithful. He pursues the unfaithful. And that's why he told his prophet, Hosea, to go and show his love to his wife again. Gomer was apparently willing to be owned for a price, so Hosea went and bought her, even though in reality she already belonged to him as his wife. She was already his, but he went and paid the price to bring her home. And I guarantee you, the treatment she got at home with Hosea was better than anything she was getting anywhere else. In fact, I love the picture of God we see through Hosea in chapter 3, where he even gives his wife time and space to adjust to being home with him again. In verse 3 he says, "Then I told her, from now on, this is your home. You must not be a prostitute. You must not be any other man's lover. I, in turn, will wait for you." What respect he treated her with. What dignity. In fact, much more respect and dignity than she was treating herself with. Hosea was the one who had been slighted and wronged. And he was the one who made all the moves to restore the relationship and then said, "I, in turn, will wait for you." In Hosea's culture, he may have been looked upon as the owner of Gomer. But does this sound like a man who's treating his woman like property? Not to me. And that's just like our God. After all, he really does own us in a far more fundamental way than Hosea owned Gomer, because he actually created us. And far beyond simply creating us, he continues to sustain our lives with every beat of our hearts and every breath we take. In every sense of the word, we are owned by him. Yet when we come home to God, we find that the way in which he owns us is completely different than anyone or anything else we have sold ourselves to in the past. When we sold ourselves to sin, we were quickly put in bondage. You ever notice that? Sin always promises fun and freedom. But as soon as you take one step down that path, you discover it's all sweat and servitude. We were in bondage to sin with no way out. But when we found ourselves trapped, God came and, to use a popular Christian phrase, paid the price to bring us home. But he didn't bring us home to dominate us. He brought us home to liberate us, to make us free again, to restore the liberty he created us to experience. That's the liberty we read about in chapter 2 of Hosea, where God speaks of his people Israel as if they were an adulterous wife. He describes the lengths to which he will go to separate her from her dangerous promiscuity, the measures he will take to keep her from going any farther down that destructive path. And then he says, "Therefore, I will now allure her. I will lead her into the wilderness and speak tenderly to her. In that day, declares the Lord, you will call me my husband. You will no longer call me my master." I love what the great British theologian Charles Spurgeon wrote about this verse. "This is a singular kind of power. I will allure her. Not I will drive her. Not even I will draw her, or I will drag her, or I will force her. No, I will allure her. remarkable word. And it teaches us that the allurement of love surpasses in power all other forces. Love is the most compelling power in the universe, but it wields its power without compelling or forcing the object of its affection to accept it. Ironically, it is precisely this lack of force that makes it so forceful. It is because love does not compel that it is, in the end, so compelling. So to those who have abandoned God in order to chase after imagined blessings in other arenas, God says, I love you still. The fact that we have been unfaithful, and the fact that our unfaithfulness is hurting us, only makes his love for us burn all the greater. And when we find ourselves broken and empty from the selfish pursuits of evil, we will find that God not only takes us back, but he redeems us. He restores our freedom and dignity, treating us with respect as our relationship is mended. God owns you, but he will not dominate you. As he said through the prophet Hosea, he prefers to be called husband instead of master. He prefers friendship to ownership. And isn't that precisely what Jesus once said to his disciples? I no longer call you slaves because the slave doesn't know his master's business. Instead, I call you friends. For everything that I learned from my Father, I have made known to you. I don't know about you, but that's the kind of master I don't mind being owned by.